Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our latest People Hour. This one's a People Hour special with a focus on modern slavery. My name's Simon Horsfield. I'm your host for this session. I'm joined by two very eminent guests who I will be introducing you to shortly. But in terms of the format, this is going to take very much the style of an interview with our two panelists, giving their views on a number of matters. We'll set the scene with a legal overview. We'll talk about what is modern slavery and how can you detect it in the organisation. We'll look at matters such as how you go about raising awareness within the business, what sort of training might be appropriate and who needs to be trained. We'll have a special focus on supplier due diligence, and then we're going to conclude with what I've called making it a win-win. How do we make this a win for the anti-slavery movement and at the same time a win for business? Just a couple of housekeeping points. Those who are regular attenders at these webinars will know that there's the ability to raise questions by using the facility on your dashboard. By all means, do raise questions as we go along, but I'm going to suggest that to keep the flow of the discussion going, we store those questions up and tackle them at the end to the extent that we've got any time left. I'd also remind you that this webinar is recorded, so it will be available for listening to via the gunnercooke Consulting website after the broadcast, which will be a great way of disseminating the message throughout the organisation. So at this point, I would like to introduce Gary Booth from Hope for Justice and Vanessa de Koofer from ABP Meets. Gary's an investigations team leader at Hope for Justice, spent 30 years prior to that as a detective chief inspector with West Midlands Police. And Vanessa is People and Change Director at ABP Meets, employment lawyer by background, but now very much part of the HR community. Gary, if you just want to say a few words about your role, that'd be good.
Yeah, good afternoon all. Hope for Justice, we're an anti-slavery charity, and we've got a really simple yet important vision, and that's to live in a world free from slavery. Unfortunately, we and the rest of the globe have got a long way to go. It's estimated that there are at least 13,000 slaves in the UK at the moment. And in terms of my role, it's leading an investigation team to identify victims of slavery and to rescue them from situations. But more and more, we're working, and I'm leading on preventative work. And for me, it's really engaging and working in collaboration with the business sector to ensure that all businesses which are really susceptible to the threat of slavery are target hardened, and the businesses are developed into fortresses, whereby that minimises the threat, the risk, and ultimately the harm caused by modern slavery.
Great, Gary, thank you. Vanessa, same question to you. If you could just introduce yourselves and a bit about your role as well.
So my name is Vanessa. I'm the People Change Director at ABP UK, which is part of ABP Food Group. We're the largest supplier of beef in the UK. We employ 5,000 people and we have 14 sites across the UK. As Simon pointed out, I'm actually an employment lawyer by trade, but also I'm a HR professional, and I moved into the industrial side of things in 2010. My role within ABP UK is to manage the People and Change agenda, and part of the People agenda is ethics, which comprises all the aspects which cover modern slavery as well as other broader human rights issues. So when I joined the business 2 years ago, modern slavery was number one on my agenda because I'd encountered it in a previous business, but in that time it was very much brushed under the carpet.
Okay, and I think the sector that you operate in is one of those sectors, Vanessa, that's been identified as a hotspot, is that right?
Yeah, I mean, our industry is vulnerable to this type of situation because it's low skilled, popular type work. So we have 5,000 employees, 84% of our workforce are migrant workers, often not speaking English. And when I say often, I would probably say, I mean, figures change regularly, but we're probably at a position where 80% of our 85% non-English don't speak English at all. So it's absolutely vulnerable to exploitation and risk in respect of modern slavery.
Okay. Well, I think with that background, really looking forward to hearing what you've got to share with us, Vanessa, in terms of the steps that ABP have taken so far, and just immensely grateful to you and Gary for dedicating this time to join us on this webinar. So thank you for that. If we move on to look at the legal overview, just need to move the slides on if you bear with me. Gary, maybe you could help set the scene by defining what is modern slavery.
Yeah, modern slavery, it's defined by two clear elements. Firstly, it's slavery, and that's simply where somebody is denied their freedom which is the most basic entitlement. How that would look, for example, in the business sector, is where somebody is forced to undertake work. And we've rescued victims who have been forced to work on construction sites for no pay whatsoever. The second element is human trafficking, and it's for a purpose such as labour exploitation. And that's where somebody is identified and recruited. They are either deceived or threatened, or at some stage violence may be used for a purpose. And most people think of human trafficking as being sexual exploitation, but there are other strands. There's labour exploitation and there's domestic servitude. There's also criminality. What's really interesting though, and really applicable to yourselves, is that Hope for Justice and my team over the past 2 years, we have rescued over 200 victims of modern slavery. Over 90% of those victims were enslaved due to forced labour or labour exploitation.
Okay, thanks, Gary. So in terms of the legal framework, the primary piece of legislation we're dealing with obviously is the Modern Slavery Act of 2015. Came into force in October that year, but the provisions that we're principally concerned about on the company side in terms of obligations really started to bite from the 1st of April 2016. Now remember that the legislation applies to businesses that turn over in excess of 36 million. So that's relatively large corporates that are going to be principally caught by the legislation. But as we'll come on to, those who haven't quite hit those thresholds shouldn't think that this legislation isn't going to have any impact on them, because it very much will. The main provision that we need to look at when considering our legal obligations under the Act is Section 54, which is the requirement on companies to produce a slavery and human trafficking statement. And that statement should include steps that the organisation's taken to ensure that slavery and human trafficking hasn't taken place in its own business, but also in its supply chain. Now, the Act makes it very clear that by issuing this statement, you're not guaranteeing that your business and supply chain is slavery free, but what you're doing is being transparent about the steps that you've taken to consider the position. Whenever there's a piece of legislation, we've always got to think about what the potential penalties are or sanctions if we breach it, and the Act is designed to encourage people to comply with the threat of injunctive proceedings if they don't. So businesses which don't issue a Section 54 statement, or which issue a Section 54 statement saying they've not really done anything to tackle modern slavery could face an injunction issued by the Secretary of State. In terms of what that statement should look like, I suspect that looking at the delegates that are joining this call, most of you have already published your first statement, so you'll have a good idea of what it will look like. There are some suggestions within the Act of the sort of information you might want to include, but there's nothing mandatory in there other than that requirement to set out the steps that you've taken. But our experience is that companies are wanting to include information, for example, about the due diligence that's been undertaken in relation to the supply chain and their own business, the risk assessment that they've undertaken to identify whether they're an at-risk business or not, and importantly, I think from an HR perspective, details of training that's been made available for staff. Really important to remember that the statement has to be signed off by an appropriate senior person in the business, so it's got board level responsibility, but it's got to, whilst the responsibility sits at the top, it's got to flow down through the business. So we've got to think about a proportionate response here in terms of raising awareness amongst your employees. We're obviously just over a year on now from the introduction of the legislation. The legislation was sponsored through Parliament by Theresa May in her role as Home Secretary then. Clearly now she is PM and she has taken the opportunity to recommit to this legislation. She's made 33 million available for a task force to drive things forward. And I think it's fair to say it is a key priority for Theresa May's government. I just did a quick search of recent cases to see what sort of things were going through the courts, and there was an interesting one that I came across just as recently as this summer, back in June, which was where a company had been found guilty of exploiting victims of human trafficking. The trafficked men were working in supply chains producing premium free-range eggs. So very small business, effectively a gangmaster business, not caught by any Section 54 statement obligation. And you might be sitting there thinking, so what? Someone's been held civilly liable for victims of trafficking. What significance does that have on my business? Well, the significance is when you go on to read which end customers were in receipt of those free-range eggs, and they included McDonald's, Tesco, Asda, M&S, and Sainsbury's. So those are clearly large corporates who have been dragged into this because of issues in their supply chain. And to me, that case alone just highlights the significance of this legislation from a business perspective. Okay, we'll move on to look at how we go about detecting modern slavery. And I thought, Gary, it might be good to just hand over to you at this point and talk about what are the typical signs of modern slavery in the workforce.
Yes, Simon. I think the first thing to recognise is that modern slavery is a strand of public protection. And like other strands of public protection, such as child sexual exploitation or domestic abuse or child abuse, modern slavery is a hidden crime, and it's hidden for a purpose. And that's because those involved in trafficking victims of modern slavery want to go undetected. So that in itself presents a challenge. But there are some features which are prevalent to victims of slavery. I think the first one is there will be an existing vulnerability. That's why the victims are appealing to the traffickers. They will have some form of vulnerability. That may manifest itself in that they do not speak English. They have low self-esteem. They may be isolated. They may have low social skills or educational skills. They may have a dependency, and usually in terms of labour exploitation, that may well be alcohol related. In terms of identifying victims in the workplace, the victims may well be isolated from other members of the workforce. They may be hungry. They may be the person in the canteen who sits alone with no food, whilst the rest of the workforce are vibrant, having meals, having packed lunches. They may be forced to work excessive hours, and they clearly look tired. At the end of the shift, they're the ones who are likely to be waiting to be picked up whilst their colleagues have made their way home. They're the ones, though, who are always on time at work. Also, I think another area to check is that they may not have their ID documents. What they certainly won't be doing is controlling their bank accounts. That will be controlled by the trafficker. So they're just some of the signs, some of the signs which, with a bit of investigation, are quite straightforward at times to unfold.
Okay, that's really helpful actually, because that helps to put it into context, Gary. And I just wonder if there's any specific examples you can mention of where modern slavery has been detected. I mean, don't really have to mention any names, but
yeah, I think if we pick one which was in the north of England, in Yorkshire, where there was a court case at the beginning of the year. It relates to a bed manufacturing company called Cosy Sleep, who manufactured beds, high quality beds for some of the major retailers and blue chip companies, retail companies. And the owner of that company initially didn't know that some of his workforce were enslaved. And these were over a dozen men who were Central Europeans who were working 10-hour days, 6 days a week for actually no money at all. But when he did find out, greed overtook, and he was complicit in the slavery, and he got sentenced earlier this year to 2.5 years imprisonment for slavery. Just as importantly, his business now no longer exists. And also in terms of commercial reputation, other businesses who weren't complicit, they've clearly had negative press as a result of that. But that's an example of a company who were initially ignorant of the fact of slavery, but then when they were aware, failed to take steps and actually became complicit.
I remember that one. Was it John Lewis or M&S?
Yeah, it was John Lewis. John Lewis, yeah. And I believe Next.
Next, yeah, good. Okay, thank you. And I guess you guys are the experts. You know what you're looking for in terms of detecting modern slavery. But I'm really interested to think what practically do you think employers can and should be doing, both in their own business and in the supply chain, to spot these signs that you've talked about?
Yeah, I think if I could just give you a general overview, and then probably Vanessa can sort of come in and add what she's done within ABP. But I think the first thing which stands out is that there's got to be boardroom buy-in. Modern slavery, as I've said earlier, is a strand of public protection. It's an abhorrent crime which actually causes misery to thousands. And for that reason, there's got to be genuine boardroom buy-in to tackle and mitigate the threat of slavery, as opposed to just doing a tick-in-the-box exercise. But complementing that boardroom strategic level, there's got to be a ground-up approach where there's a general awareness amongst the employees in the workforce of what slavery is. But actually, for those members of the workforce, there's got to be enhanced training, particularly those who have got responsibility at supervisory or management level, or who are within departments who have ownership for the policies of modern slavery, such as HR or audit compliance. I think there's also got to be some robust auditing and checks put in place around the supply chain. That isn't just the supply chain for product, but it's also going to be for workforce and employees. And I think as well, this isn't something which needs to be brushed under the carpet or hidden in the closet. It's actually something where you're not just target hardening your business, but actually demonstrated social and ethical moral stance by sharing information across the board. And it's actually around sharing intelligence and being a part of a collaboration to mitigate the threat of slavery.
Great, thanks, Gary. And yeah, you mentioned Vanessa. I'm interested, Vanessa, to know what ABP Meet's approach to this issue has been in terms of practically what are you doing to detect modern slavery?
I think for anybody listening to the webinar, the most useful thing I can tell you and how to deal with this issue is not to consider it a compliance issue. So modern slavery is all the things that Gary has said, and you know, it is indeed a crime. It's a very concerning way to treat people and a horrible thing to think might be occurring on your doorstep. But the reality is, it's not just a crime, it's an economic nightmare. So for a business, it's not, the Modern Slavery Act has not driven ABP's response to the issue. The driver of the response to the issue was a recognition that the workforce that we have been essentially using since kind of 2002, which is when all the Europeans came into the UK and it kind of reduced the cost of labour. Although we've had people to do the work, the quality hasn't improved, the turnover has got higher, the skill levels have not really been focused on, and therefore we're short of talent. And when you look at all of those factors, modern slavery and exploitation feeds into those factors. Because you talked about how do we spot modern slavery, but some practical ways of spotting it is you might have a site or a factory that operates in theory brilliantly. So it'll have 100% service levels, you never run out of labour, people work overtime, 100 hours extra a month, and you know your operation will think that's a really positive thing. But actually, what I would say to businesses is you have to challenge what you think is good, because in the real world, we do have absence, and in the real world, we do struggle to find people who want to just work overtime at the drop of a hat. So if you've got any part of your business that never seems to experience the challenge of finding low-skilled labour, you have to ask yourself the question, why? So these were the reasons we changed our approach, because I joined the business and said, we've got an unsustainable model here. The turnover is high because the nature of the work is not very good, but actually the replacement of that labour is not very good either. And if you're working in an environment that has lots of exploited people, that affects morale, it affects productivity, it affects engagement, and all of those things have a direct impact on your bottom line. In my business, we deal with the retailers, so we are a supplier to the big retailers, and we work with them collaboratively to try and cleanse our supply chain, because if we don't do that, it affects the quality of our product. It affects our ability to comply with their ethical standards. So for me, ABP's approach has been commercial. So everything that we've incorporated as a way of working to change the culture, to change the DNA, it's been done because it has a commercial benefit. The commercial benefit is we actually hope in the future, because we're not there yet, that we attract people into the business who are there because they choose to be there and want to be there. They're being paid a good and fair wage for the work they do, and we don't work them for 70 hours a week, not least because it's not legal, but actually because it's not beneficial to our business. So that would be my spin for commercial businesses. Don't look at it as a compliance issue. It's actually a commercial issue. We found a correlation between high levels of agency and migrant workers and high PI claims. And it becomes apparent that if you are exploited or under the control of a gangmaster, a trafficker, you are often expected to pay debt. You're debt bonded. And sometimes they will encourage or even indeed insist that somebody has an accident at work because they get a payout, and they won't get that payout. the trafficker will get the payout. So all of these things that you might have seen go up in your business could be a result of modern slavery. So again, a commercial impact, because insurers aren't cheap and payouts aren't cheap. Yeah. So these are all of the factors that drove my business to buy into my objective on modern slavery, because they saw, along with the human rights aspect, they saw the commercial benefit of such an approach.
And I think I'm right in saying you've gone as far as appointing a modern slavery prevention officer in the business.
Yeah, so we were the first business in the UK to dedicate a resource. So essentially I recruited a guy called Surgeon. He's a modern slavery prevention officer, and his job is, he's effectively an outreach and an intelligence gatherer. So he works with Hope for Justice. That's how our relationship has evolved. He works with Hope for Justice so that he's always at the sort of edge of the development, and Hope for Justice work with us so that they're keeping an eye on our sites from a perspective that perhaps we wouldn't have. And he speaks to every site, every worker as he goes around. So he commits to do 20 worker interviews a week. As I've said before, our workers don't speak English. Surgeon is Serbian. He does speak some other languages, but the reality is we have to have a translator. So we have a translation line which is independent, and that was one of the other steps that we took. And he conducts 20 a week along with the HR team, because all of our HR team have undertaken the Derby University Modern Slavery qualification. And we've also delivered training to every single worker in our workforce, right down from agency up to the MD of the business. The level of training that they undertake depends on what they do in the business, but for the more frontline managers, we use Hope for Justice, and they go to the sites and they deliver a bespoke training course to make sure that there is nobody in our organisation that can be deemed to be ignorant of the issue.
And is that training, is that part of the kind of overall awareness raising strategy within the business?
Yeah, because the thing with modern slavery, Simon, is it's a little bit like domestic violence. It's always been there, it's just people haven't seen it in the light that they see it in now. And the way you make something that perhaps was socially occurring and socially acceptable, socially unacceptable, is by raising awareness. So a lot of the connotations attached to using migrant labour get sort of transposed onto exploited and trafficked people. So, for example, the fact that, you know, migrant labourers work at a lower rate, or they're happy to work overtime at any given opportunity. So we are traditionally in this country, we've been very guilty of just blaming migrant labour for a dry up of jobs. But in fact, that's not the reality. The reality is, where those things are happening, it's usually because those people are being exploited. So it is something that we feel that everybody needed to have awareness of. So A, it realigns their view of how it actually works in the workplace, but B, they spot if anything isn't quite right, or if somebody seems to be working all the hours God sends, you know, they're not immediately going to assume that's because they just want to get loads of money. They might actually realise that they're being forced to work that by somebody outside of the business. So yeah, awareness for us was critical, because if everybody has awareness, it's harder to hide an issue.
Carrie, anything to add?
Yeah, I really echo what Vanessa said there, and then specifically in relation to training, you know, what we found by working within the business sectors is it's raising that general awareness of modern slavery, and that can be done through a short video on induction of employees. It can be leaflets, provided that they're multilingual and representing the demographics of the workforce. But what we find, and it's no different than if I was to walk into Manchester shopping centre now, there's a lot of confusion amongst people about what modern slavery is. You know, it's not economic migrancy, as seen where people are coming across the Mediterranean. It's not asylum seeking where people are escaping war zone areas. Slavery is very different. It's where somebody has been denied their freedom and they are being forced to do something which they do not want to be doing. Also, around raising awareness, what we've found is, particularly with people from outside the UK or non-UK nationals, some countries, modern slavery is almost an accepted practice. Well, it's not in the UK. And surprisingly, we find a lot of victims who actually don't understand that they actually have been victims of slavery. So that's the importance of a general awareness campaign. But then to complement that is actually the specific training which should be delivered to specific roles. So those roles would be supervisors in operational roles and above, supervisors and managers. Also those parts within an organisation which actually can add so much. So we find that many of the companies' HR departments are the gatekeepers or the policy holders for modern slavery. Well, actually, they should be trained to a level as well, because if there are reports, referrals, they are going to be called upon to do the initial fact-finding. Audit compliance teams, ethical sourcing and procurement teams, they're also there where they need to be understanding what slavery is, but particularly spotting the signs and responding to incidents of potential slavery. And I think once training has been effectively managed and sort of rolled out, I think the smart companies which we pick up are then saying, right, particularly those companies which I would put or recognise themselves to be at-risk businesses. So they've got some of the red flag warnings. They rely on outsourced workforce. They have high levels of migrant workers. They have spike periods where they have to sort of gather more employees at specific times. I think what they then do to enhance that training is they actually have contingency plans to respond to an increase in referrals, because if training or awareness has been delivered successfully and there are potential problems, then a positive outcome is that hidden crime becomes open, but it's those companies which actually then have contingency plans to respond.
Okay. And what kind of training is there out there? Have you come across any e-learning products on this, or do you think it's better to do it face-to-face?
I mean, look, from the point that modern slavery became a legal obligation, you know, no disrespect, Simon, but we were hit from at all angles from law firms trying to offer support for, you know, writing statements, you know, training, etc., etc. But the reality is, in terms of statements, we've done our statement. It's a very comprehensive statement because we're doing an awful lot. But we don't do the statement because we're worried that, you know, Kevin Highland and his team are going to come and get cross with us, because the reality is you can write your statement and say we're not actually taking any steps and you've complied with the Act. We do the statement because we think it's a window into how seriously we value our employees in our business. So the legal ramifications aren't, for me, the reason why I worry. I worry because of the, you know, the reputation of my business in terms of our retailers, the reputation of our brand in terms of our consumers. So they are the reason, the commercial reasons I worry, and from a personal position, I personally cannot bear to think that people are being exploited in the 21st century in order for somebody at the top to make some money. So, you know, there is a lot of stuff out there, but in terms of statements, if you're a smaller business, it's probably useful to get some input from a lawyer, but you have to write your own statement because this is your business, and it's not a statement that should just, if you're not doing anything, say it. But actually, in terms of training, I would really advocate working with someone like Hope for Justice, because we devised our training to suit our business, and every business is different. So there might be trends, And you've definitely got little e-learning. There's one called Learning Heroes. They're pretty good, and they do a very, very basic overview of modern slavery. But for your more frontline staff, for the people that you think might be able to see things happening, then I would always suggest that you get something more bespoke, which would be a combination of an organisation like Hope for Justice and of course your own internal stakeholders who can then like put the information together. So that would be my advocacy, because like I said before, it's not about the compliance element, it's about the impact it has on people in your business. The compliance aspect, to be honest, is a walk in the park next to having the police descend on your business and maybe a potential shutdown, you know, or a retailer deciding they're not going to buy your product anymore because it's got too many associations with bad things. I mean, you know, that's the reality. Don't you agree, Gary?
Yes, yeah, I do. I think with modern slavery, you know, it's a specialist area, it's a specialist field, and training, you know, it's not just about taking something from the text of a book and sort of regurgitating in a training room. What it actually is, we're talking about humans. We're talking about offences against people, and I think where it's benefits to sort of tailor the training to the specific business sector or the business itself is actually having relevant case studies which will resonate with the workforce or with those in a position where they can actually respond or identify strands of slavery or potential incidents of slavery. Because the reality is, once a business identifies potential slavery, they have to respond. And what we would offer is, having delivered training, is actually we're then there to support businesses in responding, which again is about providing a victim-centred service, but again, looking at and enriching the wider intelligence within that business and business sector.
Okay. And I'm really glad you both
Simon,
made that point, because that's certainly been the gunnercooke approach to this. You know, I think we recognise that we can be as good as any other law firm at explaining what Section 54 of the Modern Slavery Act requires a company to do, but at the same time we recognise there was a huge deficit in terms of our knowledge of what does this mean in practice. How do you go about spotting these issues? And that's why we were so thrilled to reach this collaboration with Hope for Justice, where they could give us that view from the coal face, as it were, in terms of spotting these issues and then knowing how to respond and help the victims, which is fundamentally, as far as I'm concerned, what this is all about. So I'm really glad that point's been hammered home. Thank you.
Hammered home. The other thing, though, just another point on modern slavery is when you work in commercial business, your operational people, your MDs, they, you know, if there's a problem, they like to think that, you know, we've got a handle on the problem and we've got a solution. The difficulty with modern slavery and the challenge in finding it or dealing with it is, even if you have the signs and even if somebody is a victim, they often aren't aware they are a victim or don't consider themselves to be a victim, and you can't force them to do anything. So sometimes it is a very, very slow process, and although we can train people, sometimes you won't really get a full picture of anything until quite a long way down the road. And I think that some businesses find that quite frustrating, because your natural instinct, if you have a problem, is, okay, let's deal with it. And with modern slavery and dealing with all the ramifications of it, sometimes a quick reaction is not going to achieve what you need to achieve. So that's why working with the likes of Hope for Justice is really helpful, because we do have to play a long game. I mean, if we've got problems with our labour providers or anybody in our supply chain, you know, the strategy is not to just ditch them, although it's quite tempting. The strategy is to try and gather more information, get as much over to the police and the GLA as you can, and of course try and persuade victims, A, that they are victims, and B, that they have a choice, because they're in a position where they don't believe they have.
I think you make a good point, and I think we're going to go on actually to talk about the interaction with suppliers, because it seems to me that it's one thing to tackle this issue within your own workforce, but it's quite another to try and engage with your supply chain, particularly beyond the first tier of that supply chain. So I was just wondering if you could just describe what approach ABP's taken to that issue, Vanessa.
So the first thing we did was we have two forms of recruitment. So we obviously have direct recruitment, although from our lower skilled or traditionally factory operative workforce, it's quite difficult to get people directly, certainly in the volumes that we need. So we rely on agency providers. So we have we put together a PSL, preferred supplier list, of our agency suppliers. So all of our agency suppliers are audited, and some of those, the bigger ones, are audited by an organisation called Impact, which is an ethical trade consultant, and they are audited against the SMETA guidelines and some specific modern slavery challenges. And we also ask our modern slavery prevention officer to audit all of our labour providers. So nobody can use a provider unless they've been audited. Surgeon will also do random just drop-ins at our agency providers, and he works very closely with them just to verify that aspect, because that is our biggest risk.
I think it needs that visit, doesn't it? I don't think you can do this as a desktop exercise.
No, absolutely not. I mean, it's even beyond that. So we use somebody called Impact, who I've worked with for many years, and they're excellent. But the reality is they're also very expensive, and so for a smaller supplier, that can be quite prohibitive. But you know, it is about relationship building, because quite often the risk is in that part of the supply chain. But on top of that, a lot of the people that will work in the recruitment part of that supply chain are involved in some form of corruption. So it's a really, really tricky path to tread. So the only way you can do it is have continuity of a relationship, which is why Surgeon is perfect, because he's always at the sites and always in with the suppliers. The other obligation we have under the Modern Slavery Act is to actually verify the whole supply chain. So that goes beyond first and second tier. So we have a risk assessment of all of our suppliers, and we've got several thousand, including about 25,000 farmers, and we have to risk assess them against that tool, and then we have various outcomes based on where they fall within the high, medium or low risk. And so to put that into context, and you know, I even have to do a risk assessment of my solicitors, because obviously solicitors use lots of different components as well. So you talked at the very start about the 36 million threshold, but the reality is, in my industry, in my sector, which is food, there is an awful lot of work being done by smaller companies anyway, because we are required to verify our supply chain to our retailer customers. And of course, the easiest way for us to do that is to use companies that have already done that piece of work for their bit. So in a way, a lot of our suppliers are doing statements and taking steps in order to comply with our requirements. So we do that risk assessment. We ask questions when we add suppliers to our database, and where we think there's somebody high risk. So, for example, some of the farmers would be high risk because of the nature of how they come to farm. We would then have to look at whether we do a proper audit at that point, or whether we would do some training for them to bring them up to where they need to be in terms of the standards.
Okay, and have you lost any suppliers as a result, or have you managed to work with them like you said?
Yeah, we have lost a supplier actually. Yeah. I axed a supplier, and that wasn't really because, well, it was a combination of not a very good audit, but also for us it was about their attitude. Yeah. So we're quite particular. So I don't want somebody that can tick the box on modern slavery. I want somebody that demonstrates an appetite to make sure it doesn't occur. Now, nobody can stop it. It's, you know, it's impossible to have that request, but if you are determined not to make it easy, and you're constantly taking steps to do the right thing, then that's the type of business we'll work with. When it comes to farmers, it's much more difficult, because some of our farmers they might just bring us 1 or 2 cows, and of course you can't, you know, they'll be in the back end of Beyond, they don't really do a lot of IT, and you can scare them off, and we don't want to do that. So for those types of situations, what we've done with farmers is we've done basic literature to help with their awareness, and then in our farming division, we've done workshops on modern slavery, and the next stage of the journey is we are going to send, I say an auditor, but actually somebody that's very well appraised in the area of modern slavery, to essentially do spot checks on the farm, but from a modern slavery perspective, not from a technical audit perspective.
Good. So I mean, it's a very thorough approach, but I think that's consistent with. It
is thorough, but you know, the reality is, if we do this and things happen as they do, we can't be criticised. But if you get one instance which you just didn't do, and you know, it can cause detrimental impact on our business, and you know, we employ 5,000 people, so that's a lot of jobs to lose if you lose your reputation.
Thank you. Any other examples of good practice you've seen in the supply chain side of things, Gary?
Yes, if I can pick on a labour supply, a recruitment agency, a large recruitment agency with a turnover of 75 to 100 million pound, and they supplied and still supply workers to the environmental business sector. A year ago, it's fair to say, as a company, they were totally unaware of modern slavery. They were sort of really ignorant of modern slavery, and as such, they were the unwitting victims themselves, where they were exploited by an organised crime group who infiltrated their business, and they became a gateway for workers to be put into the supply chain, into the clients. We identified over a dozen victims, as did the police, and I think what that did, what it certainly did with the recruitment agency, was for them to take stock at all levels, at boardroom level, but also at the grassroots. And over the past 12 months, what they've done is they've really been on a program change, where their culture has gone through a radical change, where everybody knows about modern slavery, and where they've taken steps throughout the business, procedures and policies, not just policies which are authored and gather dust, but actually which are organic and live. And what they do now, for example, when they do employee recruitment interviews, they actually talk and touch on modern slavery. It's not in a roundabout way, it's direct. So anybody coming through their business understands what modern slavery is. They're satisfied that they're not a victim themselves, and actually that goes through the business. But more importantly, that's then picked up within their audit and compliance. And they're aware that they're an at-risk business. They're now aware of that. I think also in terms of due diligence, what they did was at early stage, they raised the concerns and their experience with their clients. And that was a difficult conversation. And they potentially were putting business at risk and on the line. But they felt it was important, because what they wanted to do was protect the businesses as well. And what that's actually done is almost kick-started a collaborative way of working, where those clients are now working with the recruitment agency. And again, it's all around prevention and target hardening. So I think that is a really good example of how, in a relatively short period of time, the whole ethos and culture of a company has been transformed.
I know we have a number of recruiters represented on this webinar, and I think that's a really powerful message in terms of the collaborative approach with the end client, and an opportunity actually to strengthen business relationships, I think. Which leads us nicely on actually to the final topic for discussion, how we make this a win-win. And Gary, I'm going to start with you in terms of how we see the potential for this legislation and the way it applies to the corporate world to help the anti-slavery movement. And first question, do you really think it's possible to defeat modern slavery?
I think it's a challenge. Is it a realistic challenge that modern slavery can be defeated? In essence, yes, I do. In terms of my previous career as a senior sort of detective working within public protection, I've seen how things go horribly wrong, where hidden crimes are swept under the carpet, child sexual exploitation. Only this week we've seen about the abuse within footballers, and that's because it was hidden. The opportunity now is actually to uncover the risk and accept the risk. Then you've got a real chance of defeating slavery, because organised crime groups do it for one reason, and that's greed. And if their supply chain can be cut, then they will move probably to a different crime, which isn't good. But if it doesn't inflict misery on people, then it's got to be better than this. In terms of why I think it's a real opportunity, in all other forms of public protection, the main investors or interested parties have been public service, whether it's children's services or adult services, health, or the police service. This is a crime type, an area of public protection, where the gatekeepers are businesses. And if businesses can target harden their business and their business sector, then there's a real chance. Because actually, in this case, if it gets to the police or if it gets to children or adult services, then all we're doing again is responding. But I think this is a real opportunity to be upstream and really go on the front foot with preventative work.
Good, that's a positive message, Gary, thank you. And Vanessa, interested to know...
Yeah, can you hear me? Because I lost a lot of that then.
Oh dear, yeah, we can hear you. I hope everyone else could hear what Gary was saying. I think we were just talking about the fact that we can certainly make this a win for the anti-slavery movement and use business as the gatekeeper, if you like, to start to make some really discernible differences. I'm interested in how we use this legislation as an opportunity for a win for business. Vanessa, and your view on how ABP have turned what might be seen as a threat into an opportunity and a positive.
Yeah, I mean, the reality is, if I go back to what I said at the start, modern slavery and exploitation has a commercial impact on business because it drives down the quality, it drives up the turnover, it also it makes it harder to attract and recruit people because the nature of the morale is affected. So it has a commercial impact. We're in a place now, particularly post-Brexit, we're in a place now where by 2020 there are going to be less people to do the jobs that we need them to do available. So the workforce that we have needs to be looked after and it needs to be the best it can be. That is impossible if we've got exploited people and worse, modern slaves in the workforce, because it just creates an economic nightmare for a business. So this is an opportunity because what it's done is it's very much focused the business mind on the error of perhaps their ways. We became very lazy, and certainly in our industry, the food industry, we became very lazy. So recruitment was very much, I need 20 people, pick up the phone, 20 people delivered to your door. We can't do that anymore. Internally, we have much more robust recruitment processes. In respect of our agency providers, we're much more fussy and we're more robust with how we take labour and how much we use it for. It's forcing businesses, particularly low-skilled businesses, to move back to a place where you know your staff, a bit like the days of Cadbury's, to understand a lot more about them, start engaging with them, talking to them, because it's only when you talk to your staff that you'll understand any difficulties or spot anything that isn't quite right. We moved away from that and it was made easy by the excuse that people don't speak English. as a business, we've invested heavily in training on English language, because we see that as the first step, because communication is key. So although that's a cost to our business, and I'm not going to lie, it's a real challenge, ultimately, if I can get my workforce speaking English, that immediately releases a lot of potential and talent for the future. So again, a commercial benefit, instead of having a glass ceiling on people because their progression is not going to be facilitated because they don't speak English, and therefore they can't even do the apprenticeships, which they need to have level 2 English for. So you know, it just makes sense in every way, and most importantly, because the workforce see it's an issue that we're dealing with on a day-to-day basis, that we've put resource into, and that an issue that we won't shy away from, it makes them believe we're a good employer. And we are a good employer, but it really makes them see it. They know that we care. It doesn't just stop at identifying the issue. You know, we help them. If there's a problem, we help them solve that problem. We give them places to go. So that does nothing but good things for our business, and we need all of that in this current climate. Yeah. And ultimately, if we have an engaged, highly skilled, well-paid workforce, that will give us the competitive edge, particularly in the meat industry.
Yeah, and I think that employee engagement hook is a really powerful message, and I think you've touched on this at other points, but it's not just employee engagement, it's customer engagement as well, whether it's, you know, you're in the business-to-business market or business-to-consumer, the customer really does care about this kind of stuff, and customers will vote with their feet if they don't feel that the business is operating ethically. Do you agree, Vanessa?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from a commercial perspective, you know, to put it into context, when I joined the business, what ethics was about was just like doing an audit and checking that everybody had a contract, you know, weren't breaching working times. Now we've done so much in modern slavery that before this conference today, I was with the co-op, Waitrose, Marks and Spencers. We're working on a sort of governance framework for this type of issue, so that we can verify the sort of focus of human rights in our supply chain. I spoke at the co-op conference. I spoke at the Sainsbury's conference. We were shortlisted for an award at the co-op conference. So that type of issue is so prevalent with them that it brings, you know, they want to work with us, because it used to be the case that what got you the work was the price, then it went to the technical spec of your product, now it's about the quality of your people and how you treat people. That is the thing that gives you the edge. Modern slavery drives businesses to turn the focus back on their people. People are the biggest asset to a business, but they're also the biggest risk, and yet for many years now we've ignored them at the cost of profit and quality.
Okay, good. Well, I'm very conscious of time, and so I'm actually going to draw this discussion to a close. I'm going to thank Gary and Vanessa very much for their really insightful comments, very, very helpful stuff. I mean, I just jotted down a few things. The one that jumped out at me is the fact that there are, at best guess, 13,000 slaves in the UK, but given that it's such an underreported crime, the number could be much higher than that. You know, I think the fact that we've got the opportunity through this legislation to do something to tackle that issue should be enough of a driver in itself. But then, as Vanessa's made very clear, the fact that we can turn this into a positive for the business on really compelling commercial grounds means it really is a win-win. So from my perspective, it's been a very positive, upbeat discussion, so I thank you both for that. And would just close by saying if any of the delegates on the webinar have got any questions, we've not had time to deal with those specifically, but by all means feed them through to me, Simon Horsfield, or to your usual gunnercooke advisor, and we will get back to you with a response. So thank you all for joining, and we'll close the session now.